starting up organizations, as well as those who are operating ongoing ones. We have a lot of different things to share with you in a lot of different formats. These monthly webinars, which we do, which many of you have attended before. There also are the breakthrough master classes. Those master classes focus on 4 areas: survival and sustainability, leadership, impact. And there's one other one which has just slipped my mind. But there are master classes that go for 2 3-hour days, and then about a month later we do an hour follow-up. It's a very intensive, it's alternative futures, Mihai put it in the box for me. A very intensive workshops where, and there are a limited number of people, and we really do a deep dive into your organization. We bring some best practices and discussions to the challenges that you face in your organization on these different topics. We also have Seed Lab, which is one of the first projects that Caravanserai was involved with, which really helps bring startup organizations and help them develop, and some organizations that are really making a jump ahead to be more impactful and more sustainable. And then there's also the Jet Fuel blog. This is a blog that's put together. You'll see periodic articles and discussions to help all of us improve what we're doing and how we're operating our organizations and how we can actually be more successful at what we're doing. So that's a whole panoply of activities that we're doing, all really coordinated and designed to build up leaders as well as organizations, and as importantly, the whole community of nonprofit organizations in our region. Go to the next slide, please. The next thing that's up on the agenda will be the next master class, which is on organizational survival and sustainability. I think we still have a couple of spots open. That'll be February 17th and 18th. There's an opportunity to register. You can do all of this on the Caravanserai updated website, which will be connections through here. It's really a wonderful experience, and I've been very privileged to participate in it. I learned so much about the various organizations and about the way folks are chatting. It gives us an opportunity to really let the participants talk and bring their knowledge and share. And what we found is growing out of those opportunities is a lot of camaraderie and support from the folks who go through these master classes. We will also, on the 26th of February, have our next webinar, which will be on alternative fundraising tools. And the focus there will be on online crowdfunding. Maya is a very impressive speaker, far better than I, and she's got just tons of knowledge about how to do this. And many of you have seen, maybe in the news or in your own experiences, the surprising and very effective way that online crowd fundraising has helped a lot of organizations. Next slide, please. I think a lot of you probably already know who we are, but Caravanserai was founded by Stephen Bennett and Mihai Patru. Mihai is the executive director. Stephen is chair of the board of Caravanserai. I always like to make sure that people understand why and what the name Caravanserai means. Caravanserai, along the old trade routes where caravans would move largely from the east into Europe, carrying a lot of supplies, but a whole bunch of different caravan routes. There would be places along the way that were way stations where the caravans could stop, could feed and water their animals, could get their own food, and also shelter, and also knowledge about what lay ahead on their travels. And they would share both with people who were staying at the Caravanserai and also people who were coming through. And so that's the name Caravanserai. That's what it means, and that's what the project really works on, is to provide a place where you as leaders and organizations can really share information, learn more about what's ahead on the journey, and get different insight into what's ahead of us. I am not a part of Caravanserai, but I work with Stephen and Mihai quite a bit. I run a private foundation called the Western Wind Foundation that supports each year about 40 to 50 nonprofit organizations, largely here in the Inland Empire, but also in far-flung places like Maine and Chicago. So it's great to be with you today. That's a little background on who we are. Next slide, please. As we move through today's presentation, please remember that we are not providing legal or accounting advice to you. These are sharing with you our experiences, the knowledge that we've gained. Each of your organizations, of course, has its own specific needs and its own specific story. We always advise people that you should be relying on your board members, on your professionals, as you manage through what are sometimes some very complex transactions and operations. So what we're doing is some suggestions and discussion. And today, it's sometimes a little hard for us to do this, but I would really like to get some sharing from your experiences as we move through the agenda today. The next slide, please. It's a very simple overview. We're going to talk about PPP loans, the draws number 1 and 2. We'll do a little explanation on that, a little bit talking about what's there. We're not going to do a deep dive into filling out the applications. We'll talk about that because there's so many other good resources out there. We're going to talk about PPP loan forgiveness, why it's so important, how we can get it, and what some of the things we should be doing to get ready for that forgiveness and make it happen. We'll briefly talk about some other financial assistance and keeping an eye out. And then the real focus today is something that we're really excited about. It's really navigating what we see as the next 9 months as the COVID vaccine rolls out. And hopefully we see a decline in both cases of COVID and deaths, and we start to see some recovery in our economies and what we're able to do. And that requires an enormous amount of planning. That's all very exciting that those things are happening, but it also is a lot of change. And we want to talk with you and get your views on how we can move forward. So let's go ahead and jump right into the thing. Most of you have probably already applied for PPP loans. But what I want to let you know is that the draw 1, which was just like the initial one you applied for, that is back open for first-time borrowers. So if no one has ever applied for one, or if you were rejected previously, you have the opportunity to once again get a PPP loan the very first time, first draw. The application deadline is March 31st. And one of the things that's changed, and we'll hear this throughout, and I'll come back to it, is there's a slightly different use of funds that's allowable for PPP loans and for forgiveness. 60% of the PPP loan must be used for payroll. And remember, the one thing that everyone asks about is, I'll remind them, independent contractors do not count as payroll. So it has to be 60% of payroll. The other 40%, which previously to this latest changes was limited to rent, mortgage, and utilities, has now been expanded. And we'll go into this a little more deeply in a minute when I talk about forgiveness. So that 40% offers a lot more flexibility. And that's flexibility both for the money on the first draw and on the second draw. So what does that mean? That means that as you're starting to calculate your forgivenesses, you can start to add in additional expenses that you may have spent, and that will count toward the forgivable portion, the 40% of that forgivable portion. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So if you haven't done a PPP loan in the past, jump in there and get it. The requirements are pretty straightforward, and you can jump in there right now. Let's go to the next slide. Congress has approved and the president signed a secondary draw for PPP loans. This is a new loan program for people and organizations who have previously borrowed, in other words, who are part of that draw 1. Here are the new requirements for this. The organization has used or will use all of its PPP draw 1 money, and that's the first requirement. They've also want this to be aimed more at smaller organizations and businesses. By the way, just as a caveat, these loans are available to for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. But they want us to focus more on smaller organizations, so the cap on employees has been reduced. It's no more than 300 employees. And here's the really important part. Instead of just offering this to any organization, they're actually offering it to organizations that actually saw a reduction in their gross receipts. And we'll go and I'll explain how we calculate that in 1 second. Again, the amount is the same for everything except restaurants. It's 2.5 times that monthly payroll calculation, just like you did on your first one, and it's capped off at $2 million. The deadline for these applications is also March 31st. So it's good to jump in there and do this now. One of the good pieces of news I can give you is that my experience and the experience I've been hearing about is the draw to loans are much simpler because typically the lending organization already has your information. And so it's much easier to process the loans. So let's talk about this idea of the 25% reduction in gross receipts. Gross receipts are, the easiest way to see it is gross receipts are all the income that came in to an organization. That's income. And I'm going to put a really important note here. The PPP loans, even if they're forgiven, do not count as gross receipts. Okay, so if you got PPP money and draw one, that is not going to count toward your gross receipts. So that's an important calculation to think about. And what the process does is we want to compare what happened to an organization in 2020 versus 2019. And there are two ways that the SBA is going to allow this. You can look at your total gross revenue for the year 2020 and compare it to the year 2019. And let's just say that in 2020, your gross revenue was $100,000 and in 2019, it was $200,000. Well, that's a 50% reduction. Between them, that means you qualify, okay? Some organizations, however, only had reductions by quarter. So the SBA has also allowed the organization to compare quarter to quarter. So you can compare the first quarter of 2020 to the first quarter of 2019 and the second quarter, which is where probably most of the significant revenue decreases happen, the second and third quarter. And you compare quarter by quarter between the year 2020 and 2019. And if any of those quarters, the revenue or the receipts are 25% or more for any one quarter, you qualify. Okay, now if there are any questions or if I've confused anyone on that, just type in the chat box and say, please explain again. But it gives you two methods. You can do it for the entire year, or you can do a quarter by quarter. And either way, if you can show a 25% reduction, you can apply for this loan. And again, there's a broader use of the funds that we just talked about. It's 60% payroll, 40% for rent, mortgage, utilities. And then we've got some serious upgrades that we could talk about. And I want to talk about this. The use for PPP money has now been expanded. Remember, we used to, the early days of in April and May and June, we talked about, what does utilities mean? What do all these things mean? Well, there are a lot of new categories where the SBA will allow you to spend money. And so some of them are almost all of your expenses related to IT upgrades, right? One of the things that the SBA saw was that we really needed to upgrade our IT systems to be able to operate more online and to build more security. So almost all of the costs, almost any cost you can think of for IT upgrades, new computers, new software, new hardware, can be part of that 40%. Another one is important supplier costs. And these are defined, by the way, in the, if you go up here, you'll see a little a connection to the SBA site. That's a great place to go and get the very precise language, but it's pretty broad. It's any money that was spent for any supplies that were necessary for the operation of your business during the covered period. So that again gives you a lot more leeway on that 40%. And the other part that's really important is that anything that your organization spent on protecting your workers. So that's all those kind of capital expenses. If you had to buy masks, if you had to buy shields, if you had to buy more capital equipment to separate your employees from one another or from the public who they're working with, even down to things that are specified like air filtration systems and even sneeze guards. All those things are covered now under this money that you can be spent. And the other last portion is, and we'll see if I don't think it should have many impacts on you, is if during the period that COVID has existed, there was some physical damage to your space, that is also covered And I think that's kind of an unusual category. So those are some expanded uses of that 40% of the money that can still be used for forgiveness. Let's move on to the next slide. And now let's actually move to forgiveness. And please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. And I'm going to ask if anyone has had some experience in applying for forgiveness. I would love it if you would indicate that in the chat box if you're willing to take a second to share with us. But here is the quick and dirty on forgiveness. The SBA has issued new guidance, and the guidance is continually changing and being updated. But essentially, the forgiveness will be all of these loans can be forgiven if the money is used in that 60-40 payroll and other expenses split. And so that will even be retroactive. So if you did indeed spend some funds earlier in the year on your draw one, you can apply those to that loan and get that money forgiven as well. People have had some confusion about timing of the applications. A PPP loan, the forgiveness can be requested at any time up until the loan is paid off. Okay, so you got a long time that you can apply for it. However, interest starts to run and you have to start paying interest at about 10 months out from the end of the period of the loan. So what I recommend and what most people are recommending is to start contacting your lender. Some people have been receiving information from their lender and they have been moving forward. In other cases, what we found is that some of the lenders say we're not ready yet. We're not going to open the portal because the rules keep changing. So the most important piece of advice on timing of this, there is not a January 31st deadline. There's not a March 31st deadline for forgiveness. Remember, March 31st is the deadline for application of a PPP1 or PPP2 loan. So the most important information is really to contact your lender and find out how they want to handle their forgiveness and really be on top of that. It's worth contacting them at this point every week or 2 weeks as things change. You're still going to need to collect all that documentation we've been talking about for a year. Proof of your payroll, and that's payroll by person, by amount, very detailed payroll information. If we're applying for a PPP2 loan, where that issue of reduction is important, we've got to make sure we have the quarterly financials or the annual financials that show that 25% reduction in gross receipts. And if you're applying for a PPP Draw 2 loan that's in excess of $150,000, you're going to have to give that information during the application process. If you're applying for a PPP Draw 2 loan under $150,000, you're going to have to submit that information only when you apply for forgiveness. Now, don't ask me why they did that decision. I didn't do it, but that's what's there. But the most important part to learn from that is get your application information all put aside now so that you can provide it to your lenders. And by the way, these are SBA guidelines. Many lenders will oftentimes add in their own guidelines of what they want to see. So we want to make sure that we have those documents. Any expenses that you incurred, we want to make sure that we're saving those receipts and that they're indicated of what the purpose of that was for. Our goal here is to get as much of this loan forgiven as we can. And does anybody can anybody share with us anything that their experience has been in applying for these loan forgivenesses? Because I think it's really important that we understand how things are. If anyone's actually received a loan forgiveness, let us know in the box. You've got your forgiven, Amy, is that right?
Yeah, yes. We applied for the forgiveness back mid-December, and then I got my notification like maybe 2 weeks ago. So it was really pretty quick turnaround time.
That's great. No, that's really wonderful. Are you going to be able to apply for PPP2?
I've already applied for it. I think we submitted on Monday, and then our bank, the only follow-up question that they asked was they wanted me to explain our reduction in employees, but that reduction in employees had happened because when we first applied for the first draw was April 3rd, and we still had all of our employees still on payroll. And so because we're a school-based program, schools aren't open, and so we can't employ the same number of people. So now we have less people working, but more hours. So, so that was the only thing our lender asked for clarification on the second draw.
Good. Who was your lender?
Bank of Hemet.
Okay. Jeremy, there's two questions, one from Darcy and one from Valerie.
Darcy, you're right that the payroll calculation does not include 1099s when you calculate what your payroll is for what the amount of available loan is. And the second part about that is that also 1099 payments do not count as payroll for that 60% number on forgiveness. So that's right. They've finally made the guidance clear that they don't count coming in or going out, if that makes sense. I also see Valerie's question. Valerie, the issue is really going to depend on whether or not you can make a certification that the decreased number of employees was related to COVID and the effects of COVID on your operation. You may have a safe harbor there, and it requires a careful walkthrough on you're going to be doing the long forgiveness form probably, which you can download from the SBA site and go through the long form on that. To the extent that it's going to be a percentage.
Can I ask a question about it?
Excuse me? Oh,
yes, I had a question about the PPP.
Yes.
Lakeisha.
Now, we applied for it and we didn't get it. We were denied.
Yes.
And moving forward, and I know I'm thinking it was basically because we didn't really have payroll or revenue. On our 990, we have contributions, but no revenue. And then our employees are volunteering at this point. But moving forward to the new 2020 taxes, we do have some revenue and we have that. So should we wait till we file our 2020 taxes before we apply for another one? Or what do you think?
My suggestion, Lakeisha, would be that you want to get on that filing right now, and you may be able to just, even if you haven't filed the tax returns, you can present your lender with the financial statements that show that. It doesn't require necessarily that you give them, the bank, the tax returns, but if you're giving them financial statements that you're certifying to, that may be significant enough for the bank. I would not, the deadline for providing this is March 31st. If you can get the taxes done quickly and get them filed, that's helpful, but don't wait too long. And I wouldn't recommend anyone that you wait close to March 31st. You don't want to have there's a limited amount of funds here for these loans. So I would suggest you go ahead and try to do it now and then provide the bank or the lender with whatever information they can require, because you will have now a clear picture of what 2020 looks like. On Valerie's chat box question, it's going to be so much dependent on what safe harbors are available to you, Valerie, and it gets complex. This is where I wish I could give you a real clear answer on it, but it really requires a walkthrough when you're dealing with the complications about payroll. But I think based on that short description you give me, you have a good chance of getting a payroll, a safe harbor there, based if you saw a reduction in employees due to the impact of COVID. And that may be a certification that will get you there, and you may have to prove it. But it requires you going through probably that long form, depending on the total amount of your draw. And if employees are full-time or part-time, Catherine, there's a calculation. The cap is, that's a great question, and I haven't seen it. I see now what you're saying. You mean the 300. I believe it is full-time equivalents, but I haven't seen a lot of explanation on that issue, but I believe that's the case. That's a great question, Beth. Beth has asked the question, do we have to go back to the first lender? I don't think we have to go back to the first lender, but I would suggest that that be your first try, just because they have all the information. I searched through the guidance from the SBA, and there was nothing that I could find that indicated that we had to go back to the same lender. And as you probably know, there are now a lot of lenders who are have really gotten this down more, a lot of the online lenders, as opposed to the big banks, which were the ones who jumped in at the very beginning. So I've got those questions. If there are others that come up as we move forward, give us a shout, but we're going to move on from PPP loans. And by the way, just these guidances now that the SBA does, which we've linked to on the slides, are actually very good, and they've gotten them a lot clearer. They've gotten summaries and then a way to dig down. And always, if you have a question that you're really stumped on, feel free to email us at Caravanserai, and we'll do our best to either direct you to someone who can help you or give the best answer. You know, it's now about 150 pages of guidance on these loans, so I know it requires a lot of wading through. I'm glad to hear that, Valerie. Valerie kind of confirms that we don't need to go back to the first lender. The benefit of that is that for the people who have done PP Draw 2, it's been real quick, which is also very helpful. The next slide I'd like to go over is a real quick summary of one of the things that we all should be doing now is keeping our eyes open to other financial resources. What we found, and we will see probably as the Biden administration and Congress move through, hopefully, some more COVID relief and economic relief funds, that there are going to be a lot of federal dollars, both coming directly and more likely flowing through states for programs for all sorts of businesses. And nonprofits have been very successful at making sure that they are included in these programs for funding for state, from the state and federal government for businesses. So really keep an eye on this. It's something to really watch for. If you're a part of an organization that's a collaboration, watch that information because it's very helpful. You're also going to see an explosion in foundation grants. Some of the largest foundations in the country actually have done something they've never done. They floated bonds, and they're using the proceeds from those bonds to fund, to kind of do extraordinary funding above their regular funding base. And much of it is aimed at really three things. COVID recovery, right? Getting our organizations back and providing services. And racial equity is a huge component, and particularly to areas that have been underserved in the past. And our area, for the most part, most of you are probably calling from the Inland Empire. Our area is certainly an area that qualifies for that. So we really want to be watching for those grants that can really help build up our community and our organizations. There are two resource portals that we've listed here. There's a pretty good portal for California grants. It's available. It's worth skimming through. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I know that Susie Gomez's organization also has a grant bulletin. Those are two great resources to at least start with. And it's just worth keeping an eye on it. I mean, take your time to look at and see what's going on as legislation passes through Congress that may benefit us all. Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead now to kind of where we really want to spend some time and hopefully be interactive with this for the next half hour or so on a look forward. What's next for our organizations, for our communities, and for the people we're serving? We are in this kind of funny place right now, right? We're in a place where we've had just devastation from the COVID epidemic, the COVID pandemic. We're starting to see a rollout of vaccines, and it's kind of an unequal, inconsistent way that the vaccines are being administered, but they are happening. We're still seeing shortages, but we're seeing a promise of quite a few doses coming out, and we have, you know, a relatively good assurance that we might have enough vaccine for everybody in the country by the end of summer. But we don't have it now. And in the meantime, we're still seeing a lot of cases. Caseloads in California are dropping a little bit, but I wouldn't bet that that's a permanent and tremendous trend. I think we're still going to be dealing with COVID. We're still going to be dealing with the individual protections that we all have to take. The social distancing and the masking, the vaccine as it rolls out is not going to change that. So the question is, what do we as organizations do in the face of all this uncertainty? Right? A year ago when we first started, it's funny to think about that. It's almost a year that we first started speaking with everybody about these issues. We faced certain types of uncertainty, and now we face different types of uncertainty. We face the challenges of keeping ourselves and our staffs and our customers and our clients safe. And we also are facing the challenge of how we reopen our business and how we look forward. And what we've tried to do in this section is to put together a little discussion point. We're going to share it here a little bit about a way to look at these changes, a method that might help each of us look at how we do move forward over the next months and rebuild our organizations and have the real impact we want to have. So I'm going to throw this over to Stephen to talk about the futurist look and a way that we might look at this.
Thank you, Jeremy. As you talk about the PPP loans and how they keep changing and shifting, it feels like it's all just part of the whole world we're dealing with in terms of how dynamic all the moving parts are and how they all fit together. And we're supposed to figure out how to maintain our organizations, keep them alive, support our staff, make sure our programs have quality, make sure we have enough revenue, and keep our own mental health together. And it's a story that's started to be told a few years back by some of the futurist organizations about how the change is going to speed up. It's going to become much more dynamic with things happening we never imagined. And that we've got to learn to be comfortable with not having clarity about what's going to happen in the future. You just ran through a number of things, but you know, every day we get new information about COVID, and oh, we've got the vaccines. No, we don't have the vaccines. No, we're going to have systems that work. Well, the systems don't work. No, we've got a new South African virus that the new Johnson & Johnson med vaccine only has a 50% chance of dealing with. And it just kind of goes on and on and on. The new Secretary Yellen is meeting with President Biden at the moment to explain what's going to happen to the economy over the next 3 months. And they're not talking good news. We still hear constantly about the political divisiveness and some of the issues around our healthcare based on politics instead of science. And then there's climate change. And then there's racism, and our awareness seems to be a cognitive wake-up call that people are trying to address in so many different ways, often not knowing what to do. It's a very strange and dynamic world. And as someone said, and I love this quote, our new normal, what is it? It keeps moving just beyond the horizon. We get bits and pieces to try to figure out where we're going to go, but then it kind of slips away. So when, as you said, when are we going to reopen? And what does that mean? What happens when 20% of our population has vaccines or walking around like, oh, I can't get anything, and the other 80% is still subject to getting sick? What does it does to retail? What does it does to programs? And this whole idea about what we're doing in schools. So Jeremy and I painted a horrible picture this morning, and we can all just go home and cry. But you're already home, so it doesn't matter. We've got to figure out and have some way of approaching the future. And it's a concern for us. And so there's an exercise that we've taken from one of our key trainers and speakers, Jason Tester, who formerly was with the Institute for the Future. And he talked about imagining what you want your organization and your work to look like in 5 years and in 10 years. And can you describe it? what kind of services you're providing, what kind of benefits clients and people who are beneficiaries of your program are getting, how your funding would look like, what your team around you would look like. And you, of course, hopefully would be imagining this in a positive way about it being close to your desires about what it would be. And once you have that in mind and some descriptors written down, the exercise is to go back and say, how did you get there? What were the powerful things that you were able to tap in your own strength, in your own resources that would help you get there? And second of all, start telling a story to yourself about how you overcame the challenges that got in your way, and think through them. And then after you've done that, stop and think about what is it you need to be doing now to make sure you have those opportunities to tap that power and to overcome those challenges. And let me start with something really kind of old school but basic that's helpful for me when I think about how to do this. So I remember many years ago having a problem with some theft where an employee stole some stuff. And we gathered up the management team on the advice of some of our outside counsel. And we said, let's spend a few hours talking about how we could steal from us. Where are we vulnerable? If we wanted to steal some money from this organization, how would we do it? So we came up with 3 or 4 really good plans that we thought we could steal some money and not get caught. And of course, the exercise was to make sure that we stopped those holes in our protection, that we made sure that those vulnerabilities were closed up. It's kind of the same technique. If you can gather up your 2, 3 trusted advisors, board member, staff, whoever, and think about what your organization could be like and how you would describe it in 5 years. And do this with your tightest team of how did you get there? What was the power? What did you have to overcome? And how did you overcome it? And what do you need to do now? This very last thing, particularly in today's world, is very challenging in itself. What do we do now? And part of it is to be looking at how to make sure doors are open to you when the opportunity is right. And I believe that there are ways, and I'll talk about this a little later as well, but that you build relationships that you're going to need in the future. That you look at how you restructure your own infrastructure and build the strength of it, which I think Mihai is going to talk about as well in a few moments. But you want to look at those things that you can be resorting out and rethinking through that gives you strength and protects you going forward, rather than just reopening or having a new normal. What does that really mean? And we've been through a lot, and I want to suggest that it's time to be very strong and to make some really clear decisions that don't lock you into a future, but create a future where you have more opportunity. So there's some examples we'll give here in a few moments, but I want to turn it back over to Jeremy to talk about how to build infrastructure.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think, as I was listening to Stephen explain this, a real quick little short story of years ago, the first time I ever got in a sailboat, it was on Big Bear Lake, and a friend of mine took me out sailing, and it was a beautiful, easy middle afternoon, and we sailed all the way down to the end of the lake, And then a huge amount of wind picked up, right? And I had never been in a sailboat before, and it was a small boat, it was a little scary. But the person I was with said, okay, what we have to do is keep in mind where we want to get back to, which was a specific location. And in the meantime, we're going to have to deal with the wind and the waves and the how the lake, the water is moving. And we're not going to be able to get there on a direct tack. We're going to have to go back and forth to get there. But he said, but we have to keep in mind where we want to end up. It's the same issue. If we don't have the end point, if we don't have the future for our organization in our minds, we're just going to be pushed around by the wind and the waves of economy and of racial injustice and of economic things. And we're not going to have an organization that's strong. So I think that looking ahead to that point and turning around and looking back at how we get there is critical. And one of the areas that I know you've all heard me say if you've been on a webinar before or anything is the only way we're going to be able to do this and the only way we're going to survive, I believe, is if we keep a very tight eye and a tight handle on reducing our expenses and controlling and managing our expenses. I just think that everything I learn and my own experience tells me that to have real impact, to have a sustainable impact over time, to have really transformative organizations that do something, we have to have the nuts and bolts of operations in place. Because otherwise we spend an enormous amount of time and energy on those chores, and I'll call them chores, to get the operations done, and we don't have a chance to actually be really effective at reaching out. Or we do the opposite, which is even more dangerous, which is we focus on our program without building out our infrastructure to a place so that we're not in a position to take advantage of something that comes by, right? So I really suggest that right now, as we're still in this transitional phase, that being very prudent with our money, checking to see exactly what we're spending it on. I always remind this, go through that chart of accounts, find out what we're spending money on. Are there things that we can reduce money on? One thing just lately I've seen is, a lot of insurance premiums anticipated massive amount, your business as usual. And all of a sudden you cut back your business operations and you need to call your agent and say, hey, let's get a reduction in that. Or let's get a reduction or a deferral on some of our regulatory schemes. A friend of mine who owns a restaurant has been all over the Board of Health because he says, why am I paying you $2,000 for this license when you haven't let me open in a year? So I want a credit for that. And you know what? They gave him the credit. So I think that we have to always be honing this, these expenses and to really keep it careful. And that's a way to do it. And it's a way to operate and build. At the same time, we need to start thinking about how we build what's really necessary to let us make that real impact in the future. And I'm going to go to one thing that I remember Bill Gates saying on an interview way back in April, maybe even earlier. He said the one thing he was sure of about all this COVID experience was that this would increase digitization of our lives going forward. That was the one thing he was absolutely sure of. And so I'm as we think about all these Zoom meetings we've been through, all the online communications we're using, working from home, that's not all just going to disappear. There's not going to be a switch flipped and everyone's going to go back to the old ways. The question is, how do we anticipate and how do we prepare for a hybrid model or whatever is out there as we do have this increased digitization? And I'm going to ask Mihai if he can give us some discussion about where he thinks we should be going on technology as we move through this period in our organizations.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just one question for everyone. How many of you have spent some of the PPP loans or COVID relief grants that you have received on technology? Maybe put a yes or no in the chat box.
Okay.
What we have learned as, the idea of talking a bit about technology and the need to update our current situation has really come from our own understanding at Caravanserai project, how important it is to be up to date. And consulting organizations like Morgan Stanley and McKinsey have already started doing research, especially in the for-profit sector, on how technology has impacted the for-profit businesses' capacities to respond successfully to COVID. And they've been interviewing big companies, for-profit companies, and the answer was very clear. Those who had invested previously in technology were very successful in responding to COVID. And looking from a nonprofit perspective or mission-driven perspective, that's very true. And you don't have to be. And what we've learned, directly was you don't have to be a big organization to invest in some of these resources. As Jeremy mentioned, 40% of the PPP loans can be used for IT upgrades. And think about the need to upgrade your technology capabilities as a of strategic importance. And I've just thought about two things. It will keep your organization competitive long term in the new environment. There's not going to be back to normal. The normal would be a situation in which your beneficiaries have got used to being on Zoom, for example. Your staff have got used to be online. So it will be hard, almost impossible, to ask people to come back to in-person meetings. The other place is that having good technology capabilities will place your organization ahead of the pack. And although we don't want to admit, there is high competition within the mission-driven sector, within the nonprofit sector. And we want to make sure that our organizations are ahead and we are able to respond successfully and in due time to any challenges that we might face. Also, it's a matter of making sure that we are able to develop sustainable growth and provide long-term sustainability for our organizations. And since we were at we've been sharing stories, we worked early on during COVID with an organization that was involved in, it was some sort of food bank. Maybe they were providing food support to underserved communities, and they were very proud of what they're doing, and they were doing amazing work. So everything they got as COVID relief money was invested in their programs. And suddenly their IT and computer system crashed. And they had all these foods in their storage, but they couldn't have access to their list and emails and to the list of the beneficiaries list. And that made them rethink their whole strategy, and they started slowly investing in their technology capabilities. And it doesn't have to be big. Just maybe a new computer, have a good camera for your Zoom meetings, a good microphone. Make sure that your internet membership covers your needs. And I know internet connection is bad, it's not our fault, but if there is anything we can do to prevent that, maybe we should have a look at our memberships, what kind of provider we are using in order to address those challenges. And the consequences are very clear. We can provide better experiences to our staff and our beneficiaries. Also, improving our programs and making them accessible will also increase and deepen the impact that our work is doing. By having access to good technology, it will also widen our impact and our reach. We will have access to more beneficiaries, not only those who are able to drive in and meet us in person. And will also lower costs. Imagine having a good IT system that will allow our staff to work from home, will encourage our beneficiaries to just rely on, let's say, Zoom meetings. Maybe we don't have to rent a big facility. We can work from home, or our staff can work half of their time from home. So the idea of thinking about improving our technology capabilities in terms of our strategy, long-term strategy, I think that's, we should look at how for-profit businesses are approaching this aspect and really borrow some of their strategies. And again, we have limited resources, but there are some, as Jeremy mentioned, the PPP loans, you are encouraged to use some of the money you might get to upgrade your IT system. The COVID relief money, the grants that the community foundation and different counties have provided, you can use that money for improving those capabilities. Of course, we want to make our programs better and reach out to more people, but if we don't have the infrastructure to support that delivery, it's not going to take us very far. And one last thing, and I know Jeremy will talk about staffing and outsourcing. We can have the best technology under the sun if us and our staff and our team members are not trained. And we still, I think some of the trainings are free. How to better, to improve your Zoom techniques or spreadsheets or all these very small things. But once we get better at it, it will dramatically improve the way we deliver services, the way we engage with our beneficiaries, and also at the end of the day, will keep our organizations more relevant. Jeremy, do you want to talk a bit about staffing and outsourcing?
Thanks, Mihai. I appreciate that. And also, we've got about 2 more sections here that we're going to be mostly speaking on, but I also want to invite anybody to share questions or comments in the chat box. And especially, I'd like to get a sense from you all as you're moving through this challenging time as to what some of your biggest challenges are, or maybe you can share some of the things that you and your organization have done to really address some of the issues we're talking about. We've always found that in our master classes, particularly, but in Seed Lab and even on these webinars, that the shared experience of you, the experts who are really out there every day in this, is really invaluable. So I would really ask you to do that. It's very helpful for us and for other people on the call. One of the issues that Mihai raised, and it's, I sometimes get stuck with the hard things, right? I have to tell you to suggest to you that you really watch your expenses and cut those as much as you can. And the other one is personnel and both staff people and consultants. I don't like to be the one who says, oh, you should fire everybody and start over. That's not at all what I think about. But I do think to have an effective organization that's going to be sustainable and deliver something, we really have to spend time on our personnel. I just heard an expert investor say that every problem is a people problem. And I don't know if I quite agree, but it is a big point. We've got to be looking at our employees and the people who are providing services to our organizations. And the general rule is that we want to be spending our employees' efforts on what our core operations are. And it gets, IT and accounting get more and more complicated right now. And the notion that you can hire an IT person in-house to do all the IT work that you may need, maybe an employee who, one, you can't find, and two, if you could find them, you couldn't afford, because that is a huge growth opportunity. But what are there? There are a lot of very good providers who are not the enormous, top 5 IT providers who are providing services to billion-dollar companies, but who are very focused in our area and in our organizations that can provide us the kind of IT service we need so that we don't have to spend so much time, and we've got someone who's got real expertise, as opposed to someone who does their best, but it just isn't enough. And Mihai really makes the point. IT security, IT communications, managing data is going to become increasingly important. And I know this firsthand threats to that security are also increasing exponentially. And they're very sophisticated people who are looking to hack into systems to figure out the way to take money. Just put it that simply. And so I really urge to really do a careful dive on what we can do, what we can outsource versus what we need to have on staff. And again, do some honest evaluation of your staff and decide this is a good time to make decisions about, does this staff person really have a future with my organization? Are they building something for me? Do they know more about what they're doing than I do? Or am I doing their job? Those are sometimes hard questions to ask, but it's really worthwhile, and it is, to reach that point in the future that Stephen's talking about, 5 or 10 years in the future. It is what's required, and we have a unique opportunity now. This is a challenging time, turbulent time, and in that turbulence, we can kind of step forward and try to build these systems so that we can guide forward. And of course, always listen and look for whatever advice you can get from people who are experienced in doing this from outside. So, some of the work that Caravanserai does and some of the work that your colleagues do, it's so important to reach out and find out who's doing something if they're doing it well. And the last section that we've got on our formal agenda is Stephen is going to speak about effective communications with donors and others as we go through these times.
Thank you, Jeremy. And just to add to what you're saying, that virtualizing your office, in a sense, has already been virtualized due to COVID. And I think part of the key here is the idea of gig workers. Mihai just put on a resource. It's a very cool one, but also there's things like Upwork, where you can actually get people to bid on projects that you need to have done. But it's kind of like if you have less than 100 employees, you do not need an HR person. It would be a huge waste of money. And most organizations under $1 million don't need a full-time CFO. There's tons of gig workers services today, and particularly in the last year since COVID, have just mushroomed with really talented people having been losing their jobs and creating their own businesses by developing services that you can get. And as far as actually 20 years ago, when I set up a software company, we had no central office. Everything was gig even 20 years ago, and it's become much more sophisticated and much smarter. And so where I would have an organization 10 years ago in the not-for-profit world, I'd have an accountant, I would have a controller, I would have an IT person, I would have an HR person. And I mean to be nice, I wouldn't have any of them anymore. In today's world, I couldn't afford it. And let alone, I think I can get better talent online today. And so Upwork, I think, has been one of the strongest pieces to where you can really get multiple people to bid on what you're doing. Another place to go is Indeed, which is a very interesting site and keeps building. Also, LinkedIn is a huge place to go. I think Mihai's putting some of this stuff in. Yeah, good. Yeah, some of this stuff is really good. All right, so the other thing that we find right now is very important for organizations is to step up their communication. Even though we feel like we're on Zoom half our days, some of us, there's a lot of people that are feeling very isolated and unlistened to. And like in these meetings, I always feel like webinars like this, we're talking to you, right? As Jeremy was talking about earlier. And we need to set up more opportunities to listen, particularly to our clients, our beneficiaries, the families we serve, the donors, the board members. And there's a little story that happened just, I guess, Monday. Here in the Coachella, there's a big AIDS program called the Desert AIDS Project, a very large agency that's been around for a number of years. And they decided that they're going to change their name. And they said, we got a note from the CEO saying, I'd like to talk to you about our name change. And I've raised money for the organization and been aware of it for many years. And we got a call from the CEO, David Brinkman. He said he only needed 15 minutes. And I watched him do this call. And I have to say, I think this guy, David Brinkman at the Desert AIDS Project, or what was Desert AIDS Project, is one of the most skillful guys I've seen around here. But we had 15 minutes. And I want to walk through this for just a second with you, because it showed me how intent he was on doing a very good job with us in a very short communication. He started with, you know, how's the weather, how's your family, blah, 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 and had that small talk, but he was authentic. And he shared some stuff about himself, which built trust. And then you could see him move the conversation onto the management of the message. And he had some certain things he had to say to everybody that he was calling. And I'm sure he made dozens of these calls early this week, but he called us personally. And he managed his message about their history, why they had the name in the first place, their mission, how their mission had not expanded but become fuller and richer, which meant that they were going to deal with other issues going forward that connected to that. They changed their name to DAP Health. And then he was able to get through all of that and then ask us the questions that he felt like he needed to ask. And he did that all under 15 minutes without feeling rushed. And I wrote him a note and I said, my gosh, you did a great job talking to us. I was very impressed with how you packaged it all. And he sent back a note. He said, thank you very much. It's very deliberate. He says, I have a bunch of techniques I use when I do this. I never sit, I stand because it gives me more energy. He says, I get my homework done on every call. And he went through all of these things that he goes through to do this. And I think, okay, he's a CEO of a large organization dealing with some pretty heavy duty financial issues. And he's trying to communicate in a really clear plan. And I was very impressed. And I think one of the things that we're doing is that we don't reach out in a very specific way with very specific messages and try to get boards listening to our boards and our donors in particular. And some of the techniques that I've seen being used right now that I think are very helpful is having small groups of donors, for example, inviting 3, 4, 5, 6 on a phone call and telling them what you're going through, telling them about, I got Amy here right in the middle of my screen. And Amy, you can talk about what you're trying to do about the summer programs. You can talk about the services you're currently providing, tell them about some of your challenges, tell them about the money you're getting and not getting and how you're working on your PPP loans. And to ask them some questions. Ask them, did they see things differently than they did a year ago? Do they have any thoughts about how you're dealing with things like the awareness of how racism is impacting the kids and poverty and being out of school? And did they have any personal experiences and professional experiences that they could share with you that might be helpful to you? And give them an update so that they feel informed, and it's you they're talking about when people are asking about having a conversation about what's happening in their community. It's you that they're talking about, and that you've listened to them and they feel like that somebody has an interest in what they know. And the same thing with your donors and your boards, maybe the folks who you contract with for services, and having them together in small groups can help immensely, particularly if you have a couple of folks in there that you know are going to be on top of the conversation, you know, really willing to lead back with stories and input. And maybe in some of your job roles, it's not so important, but maybe with your staff, have your staff do occasionally do a round table online with clients. Talk to them about how they're feeling, what's going on with them. Amy, you're still right in the middle of my screen. So I think about the families, because I know you serve all the kids, but you know what you're really doing is serving families. You've told us this time and time again. And I just think, you know, particularly, you know, moms who are trying to work and keep all their kids home and safe and deal with all of this, they're just overwhelmed. And sometimes I think venting opportunity is the strongest bond you could ever have with them. But we've talked about these things, but it's 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 those audiences that are, in a sense, your key stakeholders, that these relationships will pay off in the short run and in the long run. And then I would add one piece to it. Given everything, and what I was talking about, how to get to the future, are there relationships, are there people who you should consider engaging with that you have not in the past that are going to be important to you? So I think some of these things can be really helpful and important, um, but taking out some time to do it. I was talking to one executive yesterday who said that they just feel overwhelmed all the time and not clear about what to do. And they have blocked off 2 half days a week where they won't schedule anything so they can stop and go over all their lists and rethink where they're spending their time, who they're talking to and not talking to, and then moving forward with it. And I think there's something really to that, because hopefully, you know, you being on these calls give you a moment to step back a little bit and think about the whole picture, rather than that bombardment of things you deal with every day you have to respond to. But I'm very interested to hear if any of you are having either some questions, experiences, or comments that you want to make about this topic, because getting ourselves organized in terms of getting our businesses under control, under reaching out as we should, having a view of how we're going to deal with the future, even if we don't know how we're going to do it yet, and how to communicate better and build our infrastructure. These are the things that we think are really huge. So I'd be very interested in hearing from any of you.